Exactly. With central authority weakened, the different districts, the nomes throughout Egypt, were effectively free to develop their own artistic visions and styles. Patrons were regional governors, local officials, even wealthier individuals, not just the king in Memphis. This led to a greater diversity of styles across the country, reflecting local traditions and preferences. That wasn't possible under the uniform state control before.
And the lack of those massive monumental projects like pyramids, was that a sign the civilization was failing?
Again, the source gives a practical explanation. It wasn't necessarily a decline in capability or will, it was largely a lack of funds.
Ah, money.
Yeah, the incredible cost of those huge Old Kingdom monuments had, over centuries, basically drained the central treasury. When the state collapsed, there just weren't centralized resources left for those kinds of colossal state-sponsored projects. So art continued, but it shifted in scale, and who was paying for it?
That makes perfect sense. So instead of massive, centrally dictated art, what did we see emerging in terms of the objects themselves?
This period saw a rise in what we might think of as mass-produced, or at least more widely accessible, art and artifacts.
Mass-produced, like factories.
Well, maybe not factories as we know them, but workshops. Items that might have previously been made by a single highly skilled artist for an elite client were now often assembled and painted by production crews. Think smaller items, amulets, often made of less precious materials, ceramics, decorated wooden coffins, and crucially, Shepti dolls.
Shepti dolls, those little mummy-shaped figures often found packed into tombs. Their significance changes in this period.
Their accessibility changes dramatically, which tells us something really significant about broader social changes.
Okay.
Shepti dolls were vital funerary objects.
Yeah.
The belief was they'd magically come to life in the afterlife when called upon.
To do the work for you, right.
Exactly. To do manual labor, farming, building, whatever, allowing the deceased soul to rest and enjoy eternity. Basically, your afterlife workforce. Very handy. And previously, during the Old Kingdom, Shaptis were expensive, usually made of stone or high-quality material, crafted by skilled individual artists. Only the very wealthy elite could afford them, ensuring their comfort after death.
Right.
In the first intermediate period, however, Shapti dolls were often made more cheaply, often of wood or faience, mass-produced in workshops, sold at a lower price.
Which means?
They became available to people of more modest means, people who weren't part of the absolute top tier of society.
Ah, so not just kings and high nobles anymore.
Exactly. What does that tell us? It suggests a broadening of access to essential afterlife preparations. It wasn't just the elite who could ensure their eternal rest with stand-in workers. A wider segment of the population, maybe scribes, local officials, even wealthier farmers or craftsmen, could now afford Shapti dolls.
That's fascinating.
It reflects a change in who had resources and the belief that they too could achieve a comfortable afterlife. It's not just a change in art production. It reflects a tangible change in the social landscape, maybe a democratization of religious practices.
That is a truly fantastic nugget right there, how the change in how a little wooden doll was made and sold tells us about shifts in who had access to the afterlife. Okay, so after this period of decentralization, regional styles, and increased accessibility, Egypt was eventually unified again.
It was. By Mentuhotep II, around 2040 BCE, he established Thebes as the capital, restored a strong central government. This brings us into what's often seen as the high point of Egyptian culture and art, the Middle Kingdom, lasting from about 2040 to 1782 BCE.
So state power is back, the treasury presumably starts rebuilding. Does the art just snap back to the strict uniform state control of the Old Kingdom?
Interestingly, no. While the state again had the power to commission major works, the rulers of the Middle Kingdom seem to have actively encouraged or at least allowed different district styles to continue.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There was a great reverence for Old Kingdom art, sure, and sometimes artists would consciously reference those older styles, but Middle Kingdom art developed its own distinct characteristics in themes, in technique. Many scholars see this period's artistic output as particularly sophisticated and beautiful.
And what defines that distinction? What does Middle Kingdom art look and feel like compared to the Old Kingdom?
The source points to several key things. There was a return to monumental architecture, though often integrated differently with the landscape. Mentuhotep II's mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, for instance. It's described not just as architecture, but as a work of art sculpted from the cliffs. colonnades, terraces designed to merge seamlessly with the natural rock, a more organic feel than the stark Old Kingdom pyramids.
Interesting.
You also see incredibly sophisticated paintings, frescoes, statuary, always keeping that core Egyptian principle of symmetry and balance, but with increased technical refinement. And jewelry. Jewelry from this era reaches an amazing level of sophistication and intricate detail.
The source mentions a specific piece of jewelry that sounds astonishing.
It does. A pendant found in the tomb of Princess Hatshepsut from Senusret II's reign, made for his daughter. It's a stunning example of Middle Kingdom craftsmanship.
Tell me about it.
It's gold, fashioned using incredibly thin gold wires to create intricate patterns attached to a solid gold backing. But the real marvel is the inlay. It's inlaid with 372 individual semi-precious stones.
372.
Yep. Carnelian, lapis lazuli, and turquoise, all precisely cut and fitted into tiny little cells formed by the gold wires. That level of intricate detail, the precision needed, it just speaks volumes about the mastery of the goldsmiths and jewelers then.
Wow, 372 stones in one pendant. That's just mind-blowing precision.
It truly is. And the statues and busts of kings and queens from this period are also noted for being more intricately carved, with a greater precision and beauty that the source suggests is often lacking in much Old Kingdom royal portraiture, which could sometimes be, more generalized or stiffly monumental.
So, while respecting the past, they were clearly pushing the technical envelope, creating arguably more aesthetically refined objects.
Yes, there's a real sense of refinement and innovation. But the most striking aspect of Middle Kingdom art, and maybe its most significant departure from the Old Kingdom, according to the source, is in its subject matter and approach to representation.
What changed in terms of what they chose to depict?
Common people. They feature far more often and with much greater prominence than in any other period of Egyptian art.
Really?
Yeah. That influence from the First Intermediate period, with its regional art and broader range of patrons, seems to have really carried over and become integrated. You see depictions of laborers in fields, farmers harvesting, lively scenes of dancers and singers, detailed portrayals of domestic life, craftsmen at work, all getting significant artistic attention right alongside the usual royalty, gods, and afterlife scenes.
That's a huge shift. It's like the focus broadens dramatically beyond just the divine king to encompass more of the actual society, the lives of ordinary Egyptians.
It is. And connected to this is a noticeable shift towards realism in representation, especially in royal portraits.
Realism? How so? I thought Egyptian art was typically so formal and idealized.
Well, the source ties this to changes in contemporary literature. Literature started to question some older, rigid afterlife beliefs and put more emphasis on the experiences of this life on Earth. Art reflects this cultural shift, this increased focus on the here and now.
How do we see that realism in the art itself, within those formal conventions?
That's a great question. Egyptian art is famous for that timeless, idealized, almost emotionless quality. The source explains they avoided depicting fleeting emotions because, well, you wouldn't want your eternal image in stone to reflect just one temporary state like sadness or anger.
You want the eternal essence.
Exactly. But Middle Kingdom art adheres to this principle while hinting more at the subject's individual character, their emotional state, within that formal framework. Kings, for example, are depicted more as they might have really appeared, not just as eternally young and powerful.
Like Senusret III.
He's the prime example given. Scholars can look at different statues and busts of him and recognize him at different ages, sometimes showing signs of age, looking careworn, pensive. Other depictions show him victorious and strong.
So, still formal, still embodying the eternal nature, but with a touch more humanity, a hint of the individual experience within the role.
Exactly. It's realism within the bounds of Egyptian artistic convention. And that focus on the here and now is also powerfully seen in the afterlife images from this period. While they still depict the afterlife journey, the scenes often emphasize the simple pleasures of life on Earth that the deceased hope to continue enjoying eternally. Eating, drinking, farming, family time, hunting. The detailed depictions suggest a cultural emphasis on making the most of life here and now, perhaps reflecting those philosophical shifts in literature.
Even descriptions of simple objects seem to gain more attention.
They do. The source mentions the sophistication seen even in things like elaborately decorated dog collars. Yeah, suggesting maybe more leisure time for things like hunting for a wider group of people and just a greater attention to ornamenting everyday objects, not just religious or funerary ones. These small details, like a fancy dog collar, paint a picture of a slightly different society, maybe one with more widespread prosperity or a broader appreciation for earthly life.
But like the Old Kingdom before it, the Middle Kingdom eventually began to decline.
It did. Starting significantly during the 13th dynasty after about 1782 BCE, internal weaknesses, rulers neglecting state affairs, loss of control over Nubia to the south, and eventually groups from Western Asia, the Egyptians called them the Hyksos, gained power in the Delta region up north.
Right, the Second Intermediate Period.
Exactly. This period of fragmentation and foreign rule in the north, lasting from around 1782 to about 1570 BCE.
How did Egyptian art fare during this time of division and partial foreign rule?
The source says it basically continued Middle Kingdom traditions, though maybe less effectively or on a smaller scale, due to the decentralization and lack of strong central patronage across the whole country. The best artists were often still available to the wealthy Egyptian nobility, especially down south in Thebes, and they kept producing high-quality work, just typically on a smaller scale than the Grand Middle Kingdom projects. Like the first intermediate period, this era sometimes gets characterized negatively.
Disorganized, chaotic.
Right. But the source is careful to point out that fine works of art were absolutely still being created, just not the huge, unified monuments of earlier times.
And the Hyksos, ruling in the north, often painted as just disruptive invaders.
They were certainly seen that way later by the Egyptians who drove them out. But the source points out that despite being foreign, the Hyksos actually played a crucial role in preserving Egyptian culture.
How?
They adopted Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, and importantly, they actively copied and preserved many earlier Egyptian written works and art, especially religious and literary texts. So this cultural engagement, even though it came from conquest, helped ensure parts of Egypt's heritage survived.
So even invasion wasn't a total artistic blackout. There was continuity, even preservation under foreign rule.
Exactly. And this period transitions directly into arguably the most famous era of ancient Egypt.
The New Kingdom.
Right. Starting around 1570 BCE, when Egyptian rulers from Thebes, led by Ahmose I, drove out the Hyksos and reunified the country.
Ah, the New Kingdom. Egypt of Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramses the Great. The Empire period.
Precisely. Egypt, at the height of its power and wealth, roughly 1570 to 1069 BCE, the 18th, 19th, 20th dynasties. This is the era of Karnak and Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, when many of the most recognizable artifacts and figures come from.
And the scale just explodes again, right?
Oh, yeah. The practice of building colossal statues, which started in the Middle Kingdom, becomes much more common and truly monumental. Think of the vast expansion of the Temple of Karnak, the huge hypostyle hall, towering obelisks.
And the wealth generated by the empire must have fueled this.
Absolutely. Egypt controlled territory deep into Nubia, up into the Levant, bringing in vast amounts of tribute resources. This wealth is directly reflected in the sheer enormity and exceptional quality of the art and architecture commissioned by the pharaohs.
Like Amenhotep III.
He's a great example. The source highlights him. He built so many huge monuments that later Egyptians thought he must have ruled for an incredibly long time. His surviving